Let's talk about the demographic transition. I would much rather talk about love, but since love is best practiced rather than talked about, let's just stick to the subject at hand, and which is population control, and talk about the demographic transition because it is essential to understanding the program of population control. What is the demographic transition? It is the transition from high birth and death rates to low birth and death rates. And as our governments would want us to believe, this is the result of industrialization and our growing affluence. They say that as we became industrialized, we became wealthy as individuals and as a society, and this naturally brought down our fertility rates, which is of course complete nonsense because fertility and wealth have absolutely nothing to do with one another. But our governments need to explain this decrease in fertility in order to hide the use of covert methods of depopulation. Now, let me show you how this demographic transition is explained and what impact it has had on the population structures. And the best way to explain demographic transition is with the aid of two glasses. So as to not be so abstract that I would lose you in numbers and graphs and math and whatnot. As you can see, I have colored my water with raspberries so it can be seen better. And now imagine that this glass is the glass of births and this is the glass of deaths. Throughout the ages, human society has been defined by very high birth rates and equally high death rates. So that the population has remained stable because births and deaths were in balance. As long as births and deaths are in balance, as long as the same number of children is born in any given year as the same number of people die in any given year, the population neither grows nor decreases. It stays stable. And this has been the predicament of human society for many millennia, which is why the population throughout this time remained stable. This is the time when we were, as a species, at the mercy of nature. Nature decided whether we lived through birth and the first 5 years of life or not, and nature decided when we died, and we died as a rule relatively young because life was hard. This stage of the demographic transition, called stage 1, or the high stationary stage, is therefore defined by very high birth rate and high death rates, but in balance, and therefore the population remained stable at a relatively low rate. Now, as we became better and better at combating disease, at nutrition, at sanitation, and so on, and we lowered the number of deaths, and we expanded the lifespan, this natural balance between births and deaths became disrupted. So I'm going to drink out of the, let's say this is the death glass. I'm going to drink out of it. To show you what happens when they're no longer in balance. Now we have a surplus of births relative to deaths. And this surplus of births gets added to the population on any given year, and the population grows as a result. And over the decades and the centuries, this results in a population explosion. The population has been exploding basically for the last 400-500 years, because as we became better and better at combating disease and delaying death. So the growing population is really the result of our success as a species. but it is also the beginning of a scramble for resources, because as the population grew faster than society's ability to grow crops, to produce food and build infrastructure, a scramble for resources was the result of this, and this again and again led to hardship, famine, and to war. Which is why this problem, this overpopulation, of this population growing too fast and creating a struggle for resources, has resulted in the two world wars at the beginning of the 20th century, for instance. Well, in 1945, when the United Nations was created, a decision was made, it was a wise decision, to avoid war by combating population growth. Had they not done this, a third world war would have been inevitable, and this time would have been nuclear and therefore catastrophic. So the international community and our governments decided in their wisdom to re-establish the lost balance between births and deaths. And they could only do it in two ways: either increase the death rate to match the high birth rate, or lower the birth rate to match the ever-decreasing death rate. The civilized thing to do was to lower the birth rate, so as not to kill people unnecessarily by continuing this perpetual cycle of war, followed by another war and another war, in order to cull the population, which has been our predicament for centuries. So they began interfering with fertility to bring the number of births down to the level of deaths. I'm going to drink from the birth glass now to make my point. Now, the population structure of mankind, while births outweighed or outnumbered deaths, looks like this: a pyramid with an ever-increasing base, which means an ever-increasing population, which means huge pressure on resources. As our governments began to subvert fertility and lower it, so that eventually it matches, it equals the death rate once again. Of course, this being a drawn-out process, the population continued to grow during the so-called stage 2 and stage 3, stage 2 being the early expanding stage, where the fertility rate is still relatively high, while the mortality rate is lower, and then stage 3, the so-called low expanding stage, where the fertility load is going down quickly, catching up with the low death rate, but the population is still growing. The population has continued to increase, which is why in the past century it has virtually tripled. We're now at 7.4 billion people, and we can't survive another doubling. Governments, having now succeeded at least in the developed world to re-establish the balance between births and deaths, they are faced with another problem. The population is now too large to support indefinitely. The population is unsustainably high, and it has to be brought down to sustainability, which has been calculated to be 4.5 billion. So governments will continue to decrease fertility in order to lower the population base, and have continued to do this, and as a result have ended up with these kinds of population structures, which are unstable because there are too many old people and too few young people being born, and too few working people to support this old age dependency burden. Which is why all governments of the developed world are in the red in this stage 4 of the demographic transition, which is called the low stationary stage, which is defined by equal birth and death rates, but at a much lower level than we had hundreds of years ago. However, the population being too high, unsustainably high, our governments need to lower this population. They need to bring it down to about 4 billion. So they need to lower it by half to what it is today. And of course, population still grows throughout the developing world, while it is already decreasing in the developed world. But overall, the overall number, the global population, has to be brought down from a peak of 9 billion, which is where it will be in 2050 because it continues to grow, to a sustainable 4 or 4.5 billion. So it will have to be reduced by half within this century. And that means that governments will continue to subvert fertility, and if need be, will also increase morbidity to lower this the fertility level, so the population decreases quickly to a sustainable level. And this is the so-called stage 5 of the demographic transition, when the population is decreasing, and decreasing quite rapidly. And of course, neither the population explosion nor the population decrease are the result of accident or nature. Just as the population explosion is the result of our success as a species, of our advancements in medicine and agriculture and sanitation and standards of living, so is now this engineered decrease of the population by decreasing fertility, and if need be and when necessary, increasing morbidity, to reestablish this lost balance between births and deaths at a lower level until the population reaches a sustainable level. This too, of course, is of man's making. It is a deliberate program. It has nothing to do with affluence, with wealth. It has nothing to do with industrialization. It has absolutely nothing to do with science and technology. It is purely the result of political decisions and the covert program of population control, which employs covert chemical and biological methods to subvert fertility and to increase morbidity when and if necessary, as well as coercive psychosocial methods and economic methods to subvert the family structure so as to keep families few and small until the population reaches a sustainable level. And this lost balance between births and deaths can be reestablished at replacement level fertility. That is to say, 2 children per woman in perpetuity, so that the population neither increases nor decreases, but simply replaces itself. So the living replace themselves by maintaining replacement level fertility. And of course, the replacement level fertility would have to be matched by the death rate. Because the death rate is not equal to the birth rate, then there is again an imbalance between the births and deaths. The population either increases or decreases, which results in instability or hardship. So as you can see, the demographic transition is extraordinarily important. It is of man's making and dictates everything in our society. It is above politics, which is why it is also above the law. It is the highest prerogative. All other prerogatives, be they national, be they cultural, the religious, ethical, and so on, are of lesser value to this prerogative of population control, on which everything else depends. Indeed, the survival of our species depends, which is why we have a depopulation genocide ongoing. It is ongoing because our governments have no choice, and because the very survival of our species depends on the completion of this program. Thank you.